Guys, I have so many books on my shelves that I haven't read yet, but I went to the library today because I needed to renew my library card, and I ended up borrowing 2 books, and that was entirely not my intention of going to the library. This one was actually on display, and then for some reason it wouldn't scan on the like self-serve checkout, so I went up to the desk and was like, it's not working, and then she scanned it and was like, oh, this was lost, thanks for finding it. And I was like, but it was on display in your library, it was not lost at all. Anyway, this video is not about my library addiction. It is about my top 10 favourite books of 2018. So I ended up reading 61 books in total in 2018. I completed my Goodreads challenge of reading 52 books, and then the next 9 books that added up to the 61 were me rereading the Roman Mysteries kids series. So I kind of don't count them that much because they are kids books and they're really easy to read, so that's why I only added them onto my challenge right at the end of the year. I counted up that I read 51 different authors in total. 32 of those were women and 19 were men. I also made a concerted effort to read Australian authors, and I ended up reading at least 1 Australian book every month apart from April, September and October. But that was mainly because I was reading Halloween themed books in October and I was reading novels that had won the Man Booker Prize in September. I did end up reading 14 books by Australian authors. My goal this year is to definitely read at least 1 Australian book each month. And I will start off with an Australian author, and my number 10 of the year is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. I was really lucky enough, and this is something I completely forgot to film when I was in Melbourne, but I was lucky enough to go to a live recording of the podcast called The Garret, which is a podcast that interviews Australian authors. The interviewers mainly ask the authors about their writing process, which I find really fascinating as a want-to-be writer. And yeah, at this live podcast in Melbourne, Hannah Kent, Alice Pung and Clementine Ford were speaking, and they were all really lovely. But yeah, it was really cool to see in the flesh not just an Australian famous author but an internationally famous author as well. Burial Rites is a historical fiction about the last woman to be executed in Iceland, and Iceland is a country that I do not know anything about, so it was really cool to learn more about the history of that country. I really loved the way Hannah wrote, in that she'd obviously done a lot of research about the topic, but it didn't feel like she was just pouring out that research onto the page. She was really just using it as a base to construct her story around. The characters felt very alive and real, and she really made the era of the 1800s and a foreign country really accessible. I found it really easy to read in a really good way. It's the kind of book where you could just get totally immersed in it. Number 9 is The Bookshop by Penelope Fitzgerald. It is about a lady called Florence. She is a widow, and her one desire is to open a bookshop, which she does so in this little town. However, the richest lady in the town has a strange vendetta against Florence and doesn't want the building that she's in to be used for a bookshop, and so starts this weird struggle between Florence simply just wanting to open a bookshop and the rest of the town being weirdly against it. I just enjoyed being inside this novel. It was very British and quaint, but it definitely had a sort of darker undertone which I really enjoyed. I really adored the character of Florence as well, and the ending, not to spoil it, but the ending is a little bit sad, and I got kind of upset at the book itself for giving Florence a sort of sad ending, which actually made me give it 4 stars rather than the 5 stars that I was initially going to give it. I definitely recommend reading the book and don't watch the film instead. It's a weirdly kind of faithful adaptation to the book in most parts, but somehow manages to lose the entire character of the book and become incredibly dull. Number 8 is The Harp in the South by Ruth Park. I've listed her as an Australian author, though technically she is New Zealand born, but she is one of the many New Zealanders we like to claim as our own, and this book is set in Australia. It's set in the slums of Surrey Hills in Sydney in the late 1940s. I believe World War II has finished by the time this book is set. It is about a family with an Irish background and their sort of trials and tribulations. There's a mum and a dad and 2 daughters, one who is experiencing romance for the first time. The other one is a lot younger and so has her own things she's going through. I really loved this insight into a version of Sydney that doesn't quite exist anymore, certainly not in the location where this is set, which is now incredibly expensive and very hipster. To me, it kind of read like a TV serial. Each chapter is a little vignette into the life of the family, and the incredibly multicultural society in which they live. There are characters from almost every kind of different background, some a little bit stereotyped for the modern audience, but always with a sympathetic view. I really enjoyed it as a kind of piece of Australian history, as well as being a really engaging story. Apologies if you can see beads of sweat forming on my face. It's currently about 30 degrees at 6 in the afternoon. I think it was about 34 degrees today, and it's going to continue to be about 36 tomorrow and the next day, which in another city they'd call it a heat wave. We just call it summer in Perth. Number 7 is A Room with a View by E.M. Forster. I've only read this one and Howard's End from E.M. Forster. I don't think this one is quite as proficient as Howard's End, but I do love this as well. This is about a girl called Lucy Honeychurch who has gone on holiday to Italy with her much older cousin Charlotte, and details the people that she meets while on holiday. And then the second half of the book is back in England at her family house and follows Lucy over the summer. This is just one of those delightful, summery, beautiful books where you just fall in love with the descriptions of both the Italian and the English countryside. The characters are all colourful and larger than life, and very English in that early 1900s way. I've only read 2 of his books so far, but I find Forster has this way of including a huge amount of themes in his book, but they are so under the surface that they're kind of hard to grasp. This is definitely one of those books that I'm going to have to reread to really see if I can work out exactly what Forster is trying to say, but I also love that you can just purely read it as a love story. Number 6 is Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. I've described this before as being an Australian Charles Dickens, and that's probably the only way I can describe it. It's one of the weirdest novels I've ever read, one of the most engaging as well. I just got so immersed in the strange world of Oscar and Lucinda. Both Oscar and Lucinda are not necessarily sympathetic characters, but I still found I was rooting for them so much, and having seen the film before I read the book, I knew that they did not have a particularly happy ending, and I was so upset because I just fell in love with them, and I fell in love with their relationship. I wanted them to be together and to be happy together because they're both so odd and had found solace in each other in the very cruel world of Australia in the 1800s. Despite all that, I think it will be one that I'll be returning to. There is so much in it. I mean, it's quite a thick book and the words are quite small. It's just so dense. Every single character gets a full description and a full backstory, and there's just so much to take in. Number 5 is Australia Day by Melanie Cheng. This is a collection of short stories, and I've said before that I've never read something that I felt so much captured the Australia that I know. Each story is about ordinary Australians of all kinds of backgrounds, all kinds of genders and races, and most of it is about incredibly ordinary things. For example, a boyfriend meeting his girlfriend's family for the first time, a Chinese family going out for dinner, and that one was from the perspective of the grandmother who had lived in Australia for several years but didn't speak English, and that was incredibly fascinating to view Australia through the eyes of someone who doesn't understand the common language used. It's definitely one I want to read again. I keep saying I want to read these books again, obviously because they're my favourites. I will definitely read them again in the future. I think I read that Melanie Cheng is writing a new novel. I'm not sure if that's coming out this year or next year, but I'm very excited to see what she writes next. Number 4 is My Year of Meats by Ruth Ozeki. I sort of knew I would enjoy this from the start. It has incredibly obvious vegan and vegetarian themes, so of course I'm going to get along with a book that agrees with my philosophy around eating animals. This was one I powered through. I found it really easy to read, and I really appreciated the very clear writing. Perhaps it's coming from a journalist's perspective where, because we have such a little space in the newspaper, we have to make sure every word in each sentence has a purpose and any extraneous words are instantly deleted. So even though that's not necessary in a novel, I do appreciate it when a novel has very clean writing like that. This features 2 main characters. There's Jane, who is half Japanese American, and Akiko, who is a Japanese housewife. And having both their perspectives in a book talking about race, I found super fascinating. I love that the book made comparisons between the way that we treat animals and the way that we treat female bodies. This is something I've thought about a lot. For example, the way that the reproductive systems of animals is often abused. For example, cow's milk, in the way that cows have to give birth to a calf for milk to be created. It's only the female chickens that are kept in cages to produce eggs. I read this book a few months ago and was instantly like, I have to read more of Ruth Ozeki's books. And then I just didn't, because I have this weird thing of like, I need to read diversely, so I don't want to read the same author's books all in a row. Then they were in my library and now they've disappeared from my library. library because my library likes to just get rid of books, presumably, that don't get taken out a lot. So I should have just read them at the time, and that is something I'm going to do this year, is not care at all. Like, if I enjoy an author that much that I want to instantly read the rest of her books, then I should just do that. Number 3 is The Idiot by Elif Batuman. This is about a girl called Celine at university in America in the 90s. And I've talked before about how I really related to Celine. It's one of those books that I think I liked despite the book itself. It doesn't really have any chapters. There are a couple of places where the book has a break and jumps in time a little bit, but for the most part, it's almost a stream of consciousness from Celine's point of view, with non-stop details about her classes, about the people she interacts with. And normally I can't stand books without chapters. I really like to use chapters as a way to measure my reading. The classic, I'll just read one more chapter before I go to bed. And they also give you a break while you're reading it. It's like taking a breath and giving you a chance to pause and sort of take in the last chapter that you've just read. However, I actually didn't mind not having chapters in this book. I didn't mind the stream of consciousness. I really enjoy being inside Celine's head, and I believe that the author is planning on writing a sequel, or is writing a sequel, and I'm really excited to read that when it comes out. Number 2 is My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This is about an unnamed protagonist, and it always annoys me when the main character doesn't have a name, and yet I tend to forget that they don't have a name while I'm reading, and I find that a really weird and freaky experience, that I'm inside this person's head and I feel like I know them really well, and yet when I go to think about them after I've finished reading the book, I really stumble over not being able to give them a name. Anyway, so this main character is living in New York in the early 2000s, and she decides to sleep away the year by using a combination of sleeping pills to hopefully refresh her life by the end of it. This is an incredibly appealing idea. I think especially when I read it, I was suffering a little bit from sleep deprivation, as you do when you work full time. Though I have given up drinking caffeine, I only drink 1 cup of caffeinated tea in the morning, and the rest I now drink rooibos, which is a type of tea from South Africa that doesn't have any caffeine in it, and that's actually helped so much with getting to sleep. I could really relate to the character just wanting to sleep away everything and shut everything out. I feel like that is a common theme amongst most people, that if you could just get a good night's sleep, everything would be better in the morning. I really loved Ottessa Moshfegh's writing. It was really engaging and very quirky, but without being too self-conscious and sort of obvious about being quirky. It felt like she truly was just writing things the way that she saw them, which just happened to be a slightly weird, off-kilter way. I don't know if I would even like the main character if I met her in real life, but for some reason I just enjoyed being in her head for the whole length of the book. Finally, my number 1 book of the year is On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. This is the tiniest little novella at 166 pages, but it packs the most emotional punch that I have ever felt from reading a book. It is about a young couple, Edward and Florence, in the early 1960s, who are on their wedding night about to consummate their marriage. And although they feel that they have married for love and that they previously really enjoyed each other's company, it has suddenly become incredibly awkward, as only it can when your society refuses to talk about sex in any way, and then suddenly expects you to know how you do it as soon as you're married. Most of the book is made up of flashbacks, with both characters remembering how they met each other and remembering their life up until this point, interspersed with scenes from the present day as they finish their dinner and move slowly towards the 4-poster bed in the hotel room where they're staying next to Chesil Beach. There is something so light and beautiful and British about this story, while at the same time, of course, critiquing the ridiculous society that they lived in, that led to this couple that should have been so happy being completely unhappy on their wedding night. There was only one qualm I had with the book, which I don't want to spoil, but the reason for Florence really not wanting to have sex with Edward I found unnecessary. There is such a thing as asexuality, or even just someone who's not that into sex or nervous about sex because they've never done it before. I don't really think that Ian McEwan had to add in this other very serious and sad and really dark reasoning that he gave for Florence being the way she is. But other than that, this is a book I would really recommend to everyone. It's so easy to read, it's so short, and yet there are so many things in it to think about. So that is my top 10 favourite books of 2018. Let me know your favourite book that you read last year in the comments. I hope you have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye!